The most powerful man in the world just made a move he thought would bring Canada to its knees, and Canada just handed him the most humiliating response of his presidency. What happened in the last 48 hours between Washington and Ottawa is something that political analysts are calling a defining moment, not just for North America, but for the entire world order. Stay with me, because this story gets more intense with every single detail. Welcome back to Global Entry News, your number one source for breaking international stories that the mainstream media underreports or spins beyond recognition. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell notification, because every single day we bring you the real story, the full picture, and the analysis that actually matters. Today's story is one you cannot afford to miss, because what is happening between the United States and Canada right now is not just a trade dispute. It is a battle of pride, power, and political survival. To understand why Trump's so-called victory declaration fell apart so spectacularly, you need to understand the full timeline of how this confrontation began. Donald Trump, emboldened by his return to the White House, re-entered the international stage with a strategy that had worked for him before: economic pressure through tariffs and aggressive rhetoric. He believed, based on his first-term experience, that Canada would fold quickly. In his first term, Canada did come to the table. The USMCA agreement was renegotiated, and Trump framed it as a massive win. He assumed the same playbook would work again. He was wrong, and the reason he was wrong tells you everything about how the world has changed since 2020. Trump began by imposing sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, targeting steel, aluminum, lumber, and dairy products. The announcement was made with theatrical confidence. He stood before cameras and essentially told the world that Canada had no choice but to comply, that their economy was too dependent on American trade to resist, and that within weeks, Ottawa would be sending its representatives to Washington to negotiate on American terms. His team reportedly celebrated internally. Some advisors were already drafting what they were calling a new framework agreement. The White House Communications Office was preparing a victory narrative, and that is precisely when Canada decided to respond in a way that nobody in Washington had fully anticipated. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who came into office with a reputation as a calm, data-driven technocrat, turned out to be anything but passive under pressure. Within hours of Trump's tariff declaration, Carney called an emergency cabinet session. What came out of that session was not a request for negotiations. It was not a diplomatic back-channel message asking for a meeting. It was a fully coordinated, multi-layered counter-response that hit the United States on economic, diplomatic, and symbolic fronts simultaneously. Canada announced retaliatory tariffs on over $150 billion worth of American goods. The list was surgical. It targeted goods from Republican-leaning swing states, agricultural exports from the American Midwest, and consumer products that would directly raise prices for everyday Americans before the next election cycle. It was not random. It was designed to inflict maximum political pain on Trump's own base. But that was only the beginning. Canada simultaneously announced that it was accelerating its trade diversification strategy, a plan that had been in development for months, but had been held in reserve for exactly this moment. Ottawa announced expanded trade agreements with the European Union, fast-tracked negotiations with key Indo-Pacific partners, and signaled that Canada was actively reducing its economic dependency on the United States in a deliberate and permanent way. This was not bluster. Canada had the receipts, signed memorandums, framework agreements, and joint statements from European and Asian trade partners ready to be released at exactly the right moment. The message to Washington was clear: you no longer have the leverage you think you have. Then came the moment that truly stunned the international community. In a nationally televised address, Prime Minister Carney looked directly into the camera and said something that no Canadian leader had said in modern political history. He told Canadians, and by extension the watching world, that the era of assuming American partnership as a given was over. He said Canada would always seek good relations with its neighbor, but that Canada's sovereignty, economic independence, and national dignity were not negotiable under any circumstances. He did not raise his voice. He did not use inflammatory language. He was calm, precise, and devastatingly clear. Political observers across the globe described it as one of the most composed and powerful diplomatic statements of the decade. The reaction in Washington was one of visible discomfort. Administration officials who had been openly mocking Canada's economic size and trade dependency suddenly found themselves scrambling to assess the actual damage. Independent economists began running the numbers, and the numbers were not good for the American side. The targeted Canadian retaliatory tariffs were projected to affect hundreds of thousands of American jobs in states that Trump could not afford to lose. The agricultural sector, already under pressure, was looking at the loss of one of its most reliable export markets. The manufacturing corridor across the northern United States was suddenly facing real supply chain disruptions because Canadian industrial inputs are deeply embedded in American production lines. What made Canada's response even more devastating was its timing and discipline. There were no leaks before the announcement. There was no political theater. The Carney government had clearly prepared this response in advance, anticipated Trump's move, and waited for the exact moment to deploy it with maximum effect. This level of strategic patience and preparation is rare in modern politics, where the pressure to react immediately on social media and cable news often leads governments to respond emotionally rather than strategically. Canada played the long game, and it worked. Internationally, the response to Canada's countermove was swift and significant. European leaders publicly praised Ottawa's measured but firm stance. Several Indo-Pacific governments accelerated their own outreach to Canadian trade officials. Even some traditional American allies privately signaled that they were watching Canada's approach as a potential model for how to deal with economic pressure from Washington. The narrative that Trump had carefully constructed, that America under his leadership would dominate its trading partners through sheer economic force, was cracking in real time. Inside the United States, the political fallout began almost immediately. Republican senators from agricultural states started receiving calls from farmers and industry groups alarmed about losing Canadian contracts. Business coalitions that had quietly supported Trump's tariff posture began issuing statements calling for de-escalation. The Wall Street reaction was immediate. Markets dipped on the news of the retaliatory tariffs, and analysts began downgrading projections for several American export sectors. Even some voices within the conservative media ecosystem, which had initially cheered Trump's move against Canada, began to question whether the strategy had been thought through. Trump, true to form, initially doubled down. He posted on social media claiming that Canada was panicking and that America was winning. But the gap between that claim and observable reality was too wide to ignore for too long. Behind the scenes, according to multiple reports from diplomatic sources, American trade representatives were quietly reaching out to their Canadian counterparts, asking about the conditions for a conversation. Canada's response, at least in the early reporting, was essentially that they were open to dialogue, but only as equals, not as a subordinate party coming to the table under pressure. This is the detail that cuts to the heart of what this confrontation is really about. It is not fundamentally about tariffs or trade balances or specific goods. It is about whether the world's most powerful nation can still dictate terms to its neighbors and allies the way it once could. Canada's response suggests the answer is no, or at least not anymore, not without real cost, and not without a fight. The assumptions that underpin Trump's economic pressure strategy, that smaller economies will always blink first, that dependency creates permanent leverage, that American market access is so valuable that no country will risk losing it, are being stress tested in real time, and the results are not confirming those assumptions. What comes next is genuinely uncertain. There is a path toward negotiated de-escalation that would allow both sides to claim some form of success. There is also a path toward prolonged economic confrontation that damages both countries, but disproportionately tests Trump's domestic political standing. The next few weeks will likely determine which direction this heads. But regardless of how it resolves, the story of how Canada responded to Trump's premature victory declaration will be studied in diplomatic and political science circles for years to come. Here at Global Entry News, we will be tracking every development in this story as it unfolds. If you found this breakdown valuable, please give this video a thumbs up. It genuinely helps us reach more viewers who deserve to hear the full picture. Subscribe to Global Entry News if you have not already. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening in the world right now, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Canada's response changes the global dynamic permanently? Or will Washington find a way to reassert its leverage? Tell us what you think. We read every comment. Stay informed, stay sharp, and we will see you in the next one.